Hey guys, it's Anya and today I'm chatting through my most disappointing reads of 2020. I've got a couple of disclaimers just before I jump into this list. The first of them being that me saying these were my most disappointing reads, of course, does not necessarily mean that any of these were bad books, but just really did not quite live up to what I wanted them to be. Also, these are just my opinions, so absolutely if any of you loved these books, then that's not me saying anything against you or against them. And actually, I'm really glad that you enjoyed them because I wish I had enjoyed them more. Luckily, 2020 was a relatively good reading year for me, so I don't have that many on here. And what I do have wasn't necessarily that I even just disliked it, but wasn't perhaps that exact thing I was looking for. The first book I'm going to talk about is the perfect example of this, and that is The Black Prism by Brent Weeks. This is the first book in the Lightbringer series, which follows Gavin Gyle, who is the prism within this world. Essentially, this is a world where magic is based off of the spectrum of light and how much light you can see and control. And of course, the more colours you can access, the more power you have. Gavin Gyle is the only one in this world who can access all colours and therefore is the prism. But there is a catch to this in that the more magic you use, the quicker you die because it has actually harmful effects on the mind and the body. This was projected as one of my top reads of the year because it's got a really strong fantasy world with a hard magic system, which I always really enjoy, reading into that complexity and finding the real nuances within magic systems. But ultimately I didn't find it as gripping as I thought I would. I'd heard nothing but brilliant things about this, but when I actually started reading it, I found it quite difficult to connect with the world and the characters. Felt the world building was maybe a little bit slow in that we do get quite a big expansive world, but the way it's explained and the fact that the focus tends to be more directly on the emotions of Gavin and the other character Kip meant that it was kind of slow for me coming into understanding what was going on and being able to truly engage. As well, I actually thought that the uses of the magic were a little bit underwhelming in that with that whole spectrum of light, there is so much potential, and the way it's done was just kind of like light being made physical, and I'm like, that's cool, and there's different nuances to each colour and different aspects of being able to summon that light and engage with it. And of course a political system that stems from that, but it just felt a little underwhelming. There were some aspects that I really liked, like occasional plot twists and the complexities within the character dynamics. But overall, I just didn't feel as invested in it as I wanted to. And I mean, this is quite a long book. It's like 600 pages and it felt that. And because of that, I don't know that I'll be continuing on with the series. This is the first one that really wasn't a bad book. It just wasn't a brilliant book like I wanted it to be. Next, I'm going to chat through a few sequels that were a little bit of a letdown based off of where the first book had gone and what I expected as the series continued on, and sadly these books didn't live up to the books that came before them. The first of these is The Untimely Deaths of Alex Wayfair by M.G. Burlin. This is the sequel to The 57 Lives of Alex Wayfair, which is a young adult time travel story. It's about a girl named Alex Wayfair who meets this man who reveals to her that she has previously lived 56 different lives and she can access them because her soul has travelled through this history. But through these 57 lives that she has lived, there's people looking to make sure that she never finds another life again. This is a book I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about. I found it back in like 2014 when I was looking at new releases and this came up. I ended up picking it up that year and absolutely loving it, but genuinely haven't heard of a single other person that had read it. That being a single other person that I actually know. Of course I know other people have read this book and I'm not the only one. The sequel for this book, The Untimely Deaths of Alex Wayfair, came out just a couple of years ago, and I was excited to get my hands on it, but it took me a while to actually get to. Part of that was looking at it and realising that it was a lot shorter than the first book, which always makes me a little bit apprehensive going into it and being like, where has the story gone and why is it not as expansive as I was expecting? That length did end up causing problems for me while reading the sequel, in that I didn't think as much of the story was explained as should have been. In fact, a lot of the questions that were left unanswered in the first book were still left unanswered in the second. And in fact, it seemed like this series should go on for another 4 books or so, because the story is definitely there, and what was left instead was this feeling of incompletion. In the first book, I also really enjoyed the romance between Alex and Blue, and essentially the way that their complicated relationship unfolds across these lives. And it took a very different turn in the second book, which again could have been great, except it wasn't explored to the extent I wanted it to be and left me feeling rather unsatisfied. It was a very unsatisfying conclusion in general to the duology, and I'm quite upset by it, considering this was one of my most underrated series for the longest time. The next book was another disappointing end to a duology, and that was Smoke in the Sun by Renee Ahdieh. This is the sequel to Flame in the Mist, which I also read this year. This duology follows Mariko, who is the daughter of a famous samurai. She's engaged to the daughter of the emperor, and while she travels there, her convoy is ambushed. She is left as the sole survivor and dresses as a boy to infiltrate the gang that she believes to be responsible for this. I loved this first book and the way that it unfolded, the relationship that Mariko formed with all the boys that were part of the Black Clan. And I thought it had a really fun pace to the way that everything came about, and her learning to live in the outdoors, learning different areas of trust, and also coming to terms with her own position in this clan. The second book follows a lot more on actual political landscapes and the state of things within the capital. The big problem for me in this was the pacing, in that everything happened so quickly that while I think all of it unfolded in a sort of manner that I would have expected and I actually did enjoy, I didn't get to properly enjoy those things actively happening because they were over so quick, and I didn't think that the focus on page time was on the particularly intriguing parts either. In terms of the political and moral intrigue that was occurring in here, there was a lot more on the day-to-day aspects of Mariko's life. And while I loved that in the first book, this book had a much more plot-heavy focus that just wasn't quite explored very effectively. It ended up being a really underwhelming finish as a result, in that everything that happened was just kind of like, okay, well, there we are, that's it. And I didn't get to experience the satisfaction that would normally come with successes and, you know, characters going through difficult things and coming through the other end, because the time wasn't given to explore it. It's rare that I go about it this way, saying a series should have been longer than it was, but like with Alex Wayfair, I think that this would have benefited just from being longer and taking more time to explore things and really let us enjoy the world that we were in. Another sequel that I have in here is Voyager by Diana Gabaldon, which is the third book to the Outlander series. This is, of course, a hugely famous series through the hype that it's had in the TV show. And I haven't actually watched the TV show, but I picked up the first and second books and ended up loving them to an extent that I didn't expect. Going into Voyager, I was a little bit apprehensive because it has this trope that I really dislike, which was the case of what happened between book 2 and 3 if you've read them. But going into it, I was prepared to power through that. And to be fair, it did still handle that quite well. What I think Diana Gabaldon has going for her so much is that she has just the most addictive writing style, and that A lot of the time in these books, even though they're so long, nothing's really happening, but I don't care because I will keep reading because she makes the banal so interesting. The big thing was that the plot takes a different turn in the world of this book as a result of changing locations, and I felt that the magic and like the intoxicating landscape of Scotland that made the first two books so incredibly good didn't quite have the same effect in this. Also, the plot just seemed to get very convenient at the end in terms of characters that were coming back into this story that we hadn't seen for a long time, and the way that things unfolded to make the plot keep going. I just found myself unable to create that suspension of disbelief to really connect with it. Another problem was some racial references to a couple of the characters in this book made me really quite uncomfortable while reading it, and that definitely affected my experience of the book as a whole. After concluding Voyager, I decided that this is a great place to stop within the series because these books are long and the series is like 10 books long and they're still being written, and I've decided this is a good place to stop. It was sadly not the same satisfaction that I had with the first two, but that's okay. I'm happy to end it there. The next book is actually a play, and that is Jekyll and Hyde by Evan Placey. This is an adaptation of the original story that focuses on the wife of Dr. Jekyll after he passes away, and she begins to lead a double life. This was so disappointing in the fact that when I started reading this, and in fact for the entire first act, it was so incredibly good and actually one of my favourite reads of the year up to that point. The way the actual adaptation is done and the writing itself and the way that the characters all come together and the way that I was able to picture it being done on a stage was fantastic. And I really loved the thematic concerns that Evan Placey was taking in terms of women's issues and what made Jekyll Hyde bring out her evil side in society. That being said, in Act 2, this took a slightly different turn where it focuses more on a modern adaptation. And while we're still continuing the same story, we get more snippets into the writer of Jekyll and Hyde. And it took a turn that very much made me uncomfortable in how much it demonised people who fight for women's issues. It did not take a favourable standpoint because of the presentation of a character that was at the end, and the ending of the play just did not at all fit into the beginning. Looking at it through the light of the ending as well, the beginning of the play just served to make me uncomfortable as well. It's rare I find that something takes such a nosedive, but the abrupt change that went on within this play between Act 1 and Act 2 definitely served to put it there and made me incredibly disappointed with the way that the story turned out. The next book is a long-standing favourite of a lot of people, so this is 100% very much personal, but that was Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children by Ransom Riggs. This focuses on a boy who travels to Wales after being prompted by his grandpa and discovers a house full of peculiar children who seem to have different powers. This is, of course, very well known and has also been turned into a major film, although the film itself did not do that well. My big problem ended up actually being with how the story unfolded tonally. I don't know whether it was the writing style or the mismatch between some of the plot points, but I found that there was this very strange mix of a whimsy and creepy that didn't quite add up. A lot of the descriptions do focus on the whimsy and making it really something almost that you'd tell in a children's story that could have been really fun and really playful. But on the other hand, it was juxtaposed with something that was a lot darker. And of course, this book has within it a lot of images like this one on the front that are really creepy and showcase a lot of the actual children. And the thing that we're told throughout is that the character who sees these pictures sees that they're creepy. And I found that the actual descriptions juxtaposed with these images just felt really jarring, and it made me not feel like I was able to properly picture what was going on because I was constantly having to reevaluate that in my head. Because I couldn't quite establish the tone or therefore the world of the book within my brain, the rest of the story ended up falling a little bit flat, and that is very much a personal experience in terms of the way I read it, just being unable to properly connect with the story. But it did mean that I didn't feel the same attachment I know a lot of people do. It was an enjoyable book, and I think it's good for people who are into this type of story, but it's not for me, and I will not be continuing on with this series either. The last two books I'm going to talk about are also sort of related in that they're both continuations to older series that I have read years ago. And the first of these is The Becoming of Noah Shaw by Michelle Hodkin. This is the continuation / companion series to the Mara Dyer trilogy. The Mara Dyer trilogy was really big on BookTube a few years back, and that's when I read it and really enjoyed it myself. I really enjoyed the dark tone that it had juxtaposed with the romance between Noah and Mara. The books themselves were a little bit problematic looking back in their handling of mental health, and that was something that was hugely problematic in this book. It's from the viewpoint of Noah, who's Mara's love interest, who has always had a sort of darker and more pessimistic outlook, and the way that this was actually written ended up taking that to a level that I did not enjoy, that I found it just really difficult to connect with, and the charm that we'd gotten from Noah before was not enjoyable. As well, one thing that really made me uncomfortable was the use of suicide as a plot point. I did not think that it was appropriate or handled particularly well either, because I feel like when books attempt to handle that sort of stuff, there's a certain respect that should be taken for it, but instead it was used in a way that just did not sit right with me. This on top of the way that Noah and Mara's relationship was deteriorating and the lack of communication between the two, as well as just the strange setup of the whole thing, I did not like. This was probably my least liked book of the year as a whole. And I'd had some hopes for going into it from the original trilogy, which I do have fond memories of. I don't think I'll be revisiting that trilogy, and I will definitely not be continuing on with this. The last book I'm going to talk about is Restore Me by Tahira Mafi, which is the companion / continuation of the Shatter Me trilogy. Like Mara Dyer, Shatter Me was a very big on BookTube and was actually one of my favourite series, like all-time favourite series for a long time. It's set in a dystopian world where the character of Juliet is locked in an insane asylum after she kills somebody with her touch. She's then removed from that asylum to be used as a political weapon. The story that unfolds is actually much more focused on the characters and the romance between Juliet and Adam and Juliet and Warner. And looking back at it, doesn't follow very much on the actual plot, and the plot itself is probably the weakest point. I think that exact problem is what made Restore Me quite weak, in that it focuses more on the political situation and what was occurring after the events of the initial trilogy. What I did really like about this was getting to revisit these characters that I once absolutely loved and would think about all the time, but it did jar that I was reading something with characters who were 17, 18 years old attempting to rule and do it successfully in a big political, worldwide dystopian landscape. I also felt that the writing style that's so beautiful within Matthew's Shatter Me trilogy wasn't as present here, and instead made it more of the focus on the characters' issues. So rather than the focus on the fast-paced action and romance that made the first trilogy so good, this didn't have that, and has led the story down a turn I don't think it needed to go. I don't think this extension was at all necessary, and it should have just been left where it was. For that reason, I will be leaving it here and not continuing on with the trilogy. In fact, I'm going to pretend that I didn't read this book and just leave Juliet and Warner and all their friends back where they were before things got weird. That's it from me today, and for my most disappointing reads of 2020. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all soon. Bye!